Greetings all and welcome to the show. Today's guest will be familiar to anybody who's a fan of Kemetic art or who happens to have seen the rather luscious artwork that graces the cover of my book Profane Egyptologists. Shameless plug. This is the second part of this two-part interview, so be sure to head back over and check out part 1, which deals with Setken's background and how he arrived at his Kemetic subjects. This episode focuses on the artwork almost exclusively, and I'll provide links to paintings that we discuss in the show notes. Now, as a side note, I should mention that this was the very first remote, i.e. Skype interview that I attempted, and there were a couple of technical glitches. This resulted in my voice having to be cleaned up and amplified digitally, so I apologise both to you, dear listener, and most deeply to Setken for the audio quality on my side. But thankfully this did not affect Setken's voice quality. Setken describes his paintings as Nouveau Kemetic, Neo-Kemetic and Neo-Pharaonic, as these terms speak to the ancient Egyptian themes that his work centres upon, and his contemporary and I must say quite striking take on Egyptian themes as well. Several of Setken's paintings have been selected for the Blake Prize and the Director's Cut. In the 62nd Blake Prize in 2013, 2 of his works were selected, Winged Set and The Artist as Beloved of Heru and Set. In the 64th, that's the 2016 Blake Prize, the painting This Has All Happened Before and This Will All Happen Again was selected. For the eagle-eyed among you, you'll notice that that's the painting that graces the cover of Profane Egyptologists, for which I am eternally grateful to Setken for providing that to us. So, without further ado, the art of Setken.
Setken actually provided the gorgeous picture for the cover of the book, which is a painting of his inspired by a trip to New York called This Has All Happened Before and This Will All Happen Again. And that's something I really wanted to ask about because I read about the picture on your blog, and obviously I was a big fan of the picture and what it represented to me. And then I discovered that it was the first time that you'd seen snow as well, in this dramatic setting with quote-unquote Cleopatra's Needle in Central Park. So would you mind kind of going into the story of how that painting was conceived and what it means?
Yeah. So I had read Bob Breer's Egyptomania book and was aware that there was an obelisk in Central Park that you could view from the Metropolitan Museum of Art, which I spent a large part of a day in the Egyptian area alone. So I finally, I think it was my first day actually, in America, I flew into New Jersey because snowstorms had interrupted the flight from LA to New York, so I flew into Jersey and got a taxi in. And when I stepped outside and it was snowing, it was like, man, this is snow. And it stayed with me for the whole trip, and I hated it. I'm a summer kind of guy, and all of the things that go along with snow that I hadn't been prepared for. Like I just thought normal Australian winter clothes would be fine in New York. My balls literally freeze like outside, and then I found out that's because of the temperature differential between the testicles and temperature, and that all got explained to me afterwards, and I'm glad that I know that now. But anyhow, snow was a big thing and governed a lot of the first part of that trip because there was a large chance I could have been trapped in New York for the whole time. It was pretty thick, and they were threatening to close my flight out. I got to see the obelisk that we call, was one obelisk that's known as Cleopatra's Needle. It's that one in Central Park, and of course there's the other one on the Thames that you're very familiar with, of course. Through one of the large windows at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. I think it was the Italian wing. And I remember standing at the end and looking out and being able to see Central Park, and there was the obelisk, and I thought, damn, that's it. So I hadn't seen it before on previous trips to New York, and I walked up to the window and I gauged that I could walk out of the museum and go and visit it, which is what I did, stupidly or not, and went right up close to it and around it, and all the plaques and everything were covered. The plaques that were on the base of the monument to say how it got over there and everything else. But I did get to take lots of photos and was fascinated at how the snow was sitting inside some of the hieroglyphic carved reliefs.
Mm.
So I took photos of all four sides, which eventually I was able to reference and work out which side that I wanted to depict in the painting, which is actually the side, if I recall correctly, facing the Metropolitan Museum of Art. So that would have been the first one that I saw. And at that stage, the painting hadn't quite developed. I planned to go to Boston, to the Boston Museum of Fine Arts, to see their collection on the train. And the trains are quite nice affairs, and they had these nice cushy seats and a kind of table that I was able to bring my sketch pads out and work on stuff. And I started to do what was the initial sketch for that painting that ended up on the cover of your book, somewhere between New York and Boston. And I remember the guy that was sitting opposite me at the end saying, "Hey man, I love all that Egyptian stuff too. That's like Cleopatra and stuff, right?" So my sketches are actually not sketches in the traditional sense. They're actually more of a shorthand. You wouldn't look at my sketches and think, "Oh man, that guy's going to be a great artist," or "He's got lots of skill." They're very similar to something that a child might draw, really. But I had this very solid image of the obelisk, two deities on either side, and I knew exactly who those deities were. I knew that I had to have the set sphinxes in there and the snow and the background as it was. It was conceived on the train. The title, "This has all happened before and this will all happen again," is actually taken from the Battlestar Galactica reboot.
Yes.
Which is a series that fascinated me because it really did play around with the concept of a soul and what makes a being sentient and what compromises a valid bona fide being and not. And the whole idea that the Cylons could take human form now and have their souls downloaded into them was interesting. And they also reference the whole theory and notion of eternal return, which for a pop science fiction series to be able to get that in there somehow, I thought was pretty good. And the entire painting, as you know, is black and white, apart from those very Cylon-esque red hieroglyphs. I got Tamra Suda to have a look over the hieroglyphs for me. To make sure.
Is the, sorry, just interjecting for the audience, Tamra Suda is the head of the Kemetic Orthodox Kemetic movement.
Yes, and she's also an Egyptologist, and I've commissioned Tamara to do quite a few of the hieroglyphic phrases for me that have appeared in many of my earlier paintings. And even though some of the hieroglyphs in that painting are not as clear as we know that they can be, they were accurate to what they are now in, post pollution, erosion and everything in modern day New York City.
Yes, and I noticed that when you were speaking about the work on your blog, talking about the various, the current state of the hieroglyphs themselves, and talking about some of the translations and previous translations of certain symbols that you'd looked at. There was a great deal of depth of research that went into the depiction and translation of those hieroglyphs, and I've noticed that as a recurring theme in your work. And you invariably employing Egyptologists, and of course, yes, Tamara is excellent when it comes to hieroglyphs, far more proficient than myself, and
me,
and many of us, to be fair. Hieroglyphs is even within Egyptology, any real proficiency is increasingly rare, I'm sad to say, these days. But I noticed this real attention to detail when it came to that. And I find it really interesting that you say that that there was a childlike simplicity to the drawings, because I wouldn't have. That's not a terminology I would have used myself. Clean, I think, is the first thing that struck me. It's the clean lines, very crisp, and
that's for the painting, yes.
Yeah.
But the actual drawings, because they all originate as drawings,
right,
are they're it's like a shorthand. When I conceive a painting, it's pretty well all there. It's there and manifested and ready to go. So I'm trying to pull down with pencil and paper the outline, and I know that I'll remember the colours later, and if I think that I'm going to forget, I'll put an arrow and say this needs to be this colour or whatever.
Yeah.
The drawings are childlike and simple, but the paintings take on a bit more sophistication by the time they reach the canvas or the panel.
Absolutely.
I hope.
No, they do. They do.
It's my hope that they do.
No, they absolutely do. And one thing that I've realised looking at your body of work, especially as it's developed over the years, is the actually deceptive level of complexity in there. Even though the images themselves, they're very bold images, but there's a layer, there are many layers underneath all of that, and getting into your work, every time I look at one of your pictures, I notice something new in it, and that to me is testament of a fine piece of work. One of the other pieces that I was interested in at the time for the cover of the book, just because I found it so striking and so bold, was the triple Setken, which I think you said was inspired when you were in the United States.
Yes. So I think it was my very first trip to New York City, and I've been there about 3 or 4 times now. I've lost count. At one stage, the area of the Metropolitan Museum of Art, where all the Egyptian antiquities are held, the area where they've reconstructed that temple, I've forgotten the name of the temple, but it's separate to where all the other antiquities are kept, and they built it so that there is a pond and it's got a beautiful glass ceiling so the sunlight comes through, and they've reconstructed one of the temples that was going to go underwater when the Aswan Dam was built. So in that area, they used to have 6 Sekhmet statues of similar height, all in a row along the wall, and I really wanted to get a photo of it. This was way before any of the real Kemetic stuff had emerged, and I was sitting on the edge of the built-up pond, and there were that many people in there. I just thought, you know what, I am never going to get this long shot painting that I want, this long shot photograph of these statues that I want, because there are people everywhere. And behold, everyone just disappeared. And I had these 6 statues ready to be photographed with this disposable long shot camera that I bought. And I've got that photo up somewhere on my blog.
Yeah, it is there. It's right there.
Yeah. So that was my first encounter with those statues, and subsequent visits, they had split the statues up. I think one had been lent to one of the other museums. Two were in another part of the Egyptian section, and they left three in that area where the temple was. And it was that photograph that I took that brought about triple Sekhmet.
Beautiful work.
And that's also one of my favourite pieces. Sold now. That's one of the pieces of work that has been sold.
Missed my chance, eh?
I guess.
No, it's a really striking piece, and it's funny because it struck me because we have a small collection of Sekhmet statuary in the British Museum, and
I've seen them.
Yes, and they occupy a similar kind of, not a similar space per se, but a similar layout next to each other like that, and they were always very striking to me, those pictures. So and I remember Richard Reedy actually saying the same thing in our correspondence, that he had seen the Sekhmet statues. I believe it was at the British Museum that particular time, and then really striking him as just really incredibly powerful imagery, which I think you captured beautifully there.
Thank you.
Moving on, we covered earlier very briefly when we were talking about Hebak and the works of R.A. Schweller de Lubitsch. The cover of Hebak volume, Hebak is volume 2, isn't it, of the series?
Yeah.
By Lucy Lamy, is it?
Yes.
And
that was their daughter.
Their daughter, that's right. Yeah, and it's a really nicely composed register scene with Osiris, Oza. Material Immortality is a wonderful piece that you said was subconsciously inspired by that. Would you be able to tell us about the conception of material immortality and what that's about?
Yes. So material immortality is a painting about my quest and interest in physical immortality, and the whole exploration of why our bodies die, and do they need to die? Did our bodies always die? These stories from the Bible of people like Ezekiel and Jesus and some of the others that were said to not die but simply transform into another state. I feel that the text and the imagery of Kemet alludes to this, and the very mysterious paintings and images in the mortuary temple of Seti I in Abydos have got quite a few unexplained images and images that are obviously tied up with the process of the soul, and in this case after death, that I don't think we've been able to sufficiently explain. There is a column on one of those paintings where you will find, in my painting, Material Immortality, there is a sarcophagus with a lion-headed deity that is has a vulture over its chest. Well, that's taken directly from that temple. That's actually a smaller painting from one of the wall paintings in there. And the actual sarcophagus in my painting was based on the one that Seti I was found in, now in the John Soames Museum in London. And I actually paid quite a bit actually, to get hold of the original documents of the people that, I forget their names now, I should have that on hand, but when the sarcophagus was bought by John Soames, he had two Egyptologists document the hieroglyphs on the inside and the outside of the sarcophagus, and they were in a blue ink, a blue paint, so very white alabaster, very blue ink made that sarcophagus quite different to what it looks like today.
Yeah.
And I got the original copies of those from the John Soames Museum, because at one stage I had intended to do something on Seti's sarcophagus itself. That kind of took a back burner, and I developed the image of the sarcophagus that you can see in my painting, which relates to the complete anatomy of the human on a spiritual and physical level. So the actual sarcophagus would be the body, and the 8 shrines that are depicted on the outside represent one aspect of soul anatomy.
And soul anatomy is an area that you've had quite a deep dive into yourself, actually, and I've noticed that, as you quite rightly mentioned on your blog, there are somewhat conflicting records of the numbers of the soul anatomy.
Yes.
But this was very much a preoccupation of the Egyptians, the different bodies and which ones would endure.
Right, yes. I've looked at a lot of different sources to help with my intellectual understanding of soul anatomy, and I guess one of the better ones I've come across has been outlined by Don Webb, who is one of the people in the Temple of Set. He's written a number of books that I found to be very helpful. His outline of Egyptian soul anatomy, I think, is very spot on. He obviously understands it on a level that I would also like to get to at some stage, and I have found it helpful in my own explorations as well. Some of the other books that I've read, everyone seems to get bits and pieces of it right, or they offer one piece of the puzzle that the other doesn't have. So I'm not quick to dismiss everyone. I'm not quick to dismiss anyone, in fact. Everyone's trying to have a go to trying to work out what this is. But it also hasn't escaped my attention that we still, as much as we've made strides ahead with our understanding of hieroglyphs and decipherment, there are still things we don't understand. There are still complete panels from the shrines of Tutankhamun that are considered to be cryptographic and unsolvable. And perhaps this is where we need to turn back to what R.A. Schwaller-Delubich was saying, and we need to find a different way to read what these glyphs and images are telling us.
Absolutely, and it's fair to say that a lot of the earlier translations of Egyptian materials were undertaken through a, let's call it, a Western monotheistic lens,
Right.
not trying to understand the Egyptian mindset in its own terms again. And,
Right.
We have kind of chapters of quote-unquote miscellaneous gods in Baj, and we have Adolf Ehrman and Maspero saying that the hieroglyphs weren't worth the effort necessarily of disentangling them. And this all comes from this preconception, I think, and it's a very unfair preconception that had been left to us from really from classical education and the Greeks, that they had expected, the translators of the hieroglyphs had expected to find the equivalent of Plato, of Aristotle, of Socrates, of Pythagoras in Egypt. And what they'd actually found, I think, is probably fair to say, for a very, this is a very rough analogy, but something more akin to the Zen of the Egyptian desert than Western philosophical concepts. And that's something that I think we're still struggling with as a field to acknowledge, that like you quite rightly say, these things aren't necessarily cryptic so much as they are not being approached with necessarily the mindset that the Egyptians had intended them to be approached with. Jeremy Nadler, in his work on shamanic wisdom pyramid texts, I cover his work to a degree, though I'm more occupied with his Egyptological treatments, but his work on looking at the shamanic aspects of Egyptian ritual, so to speak, and the Egyptian mindset is really very fascinating, and something that I do encourage people to take a look at, even if we sometimes disagree on the terminology. I think it's fair to say that, you know, the point that you're making about there being a lot more going on there than we've previously acknowledged is something we need to explore more. And this is kind of one of those points where we can go in so many different directions here, but I wanted to also take a look at painting from one of your earlier works, Downloading Nature.
Yes.
And I just thought it was wonderful. It really struck me from the outset of how this, no pun intended, but it just plugs in to so many of the concepts that I've come across over the last few years related to Kemeticism. And it has the central figure, is that you, the central figure, plugged into the Kemetic deities in the registers? It's a very interesting image.
Yes. So that is a rendering of my form from a photo, and I put the gas mask in the particular painting because it references being able to enter a realm where if you don't wear something to help get through, you're not going to be able to see or experience it. I haven't articulated that as well as I could have, but that's pretty well it. Also, there is a little bit of a S&M-y thing going on there as well, because there are the ankle and wrist bracelets on there as well.
Right.
One of my former professions was as a fetish model. I did that for a while at one stage of my career. It wasn't very long lived, and there are good reasons why. But I used that image and the gas mask, which once upon a time was very much an image of war. Now I think, every time I see a gas mask like that, I think of bondage and fetish stuff. I don't think of war. So that aside, the imagery for that particular painting was that of being able to move into another realm, but perhaps needing help to do so. And back when I painted that painting, everything was still very new to me. And actually the concept of downloading was still a rather new thing. And you'll notice that there are no hieroglyphs in there to say who the Netru are. So it was quite an early painting, because I always include hieroglyphs unless it's exceptionally clear who the particular Netru is otherwise. And all of those tubes leading into different parts of my body, some of them I knew why, and others I didn't. But I followed the authenticity of the original vision from the sketch I had made, and pursued it complete with the hexagonal background, which I've used in a few paintings, and there's another one sitting on the easel that I showed you earlier.
I noticed that. Yeah, I noticed the hexagonal background, and I wanted to reference it to this one.
Hexagonals, when I'm thinking of veils between worlds, I sense that there is a hexagonal dynamic or vibration or something that translates itself into the number 6 and that shape that is like a kind of veil. And I've used that in a few paintings to date. The hexagon was used in ancient Egypt. You can find it on the patternings of some of the goddesses' dresses. Mm-hmm. They were, of course, very aware of honeycomb and the importance of the bee. But the 5-pointed star, 6-pointed star, 7-pointed star, and octagonals, I have found an example of all of those through Egyptian art and again in Islamic art as well. I noticed octagonals particularly when I was in Egypt those last 2 times that I went.
And for those who are listening on mobile devices and can't actually reference or see the picture picture of the body is painted black, and there's a reference to the Kabit, the shadow body there. So this is also an early exploration of that concept as well.
The Kabit I started to introduce in the paintings that came just after. And my early depictions of the Kabit are that figure that looks humanoid with like dragonfly wings.
Yeah.
That you can see in the black painting.
Yes.
And I think also I included that in Anger. There are other paintings that I included that version of the Kabit in as well. I would say that while I was still unraveling soul anatomy, that was probably the first version of the Kabit that I was unconsciously exploring. So it's interesting that you picked that up, and I'm thinking about that now.
Well, I hope that people listening do come back and have a look at the paintings you've got here, so that they can see just how striking the imagery is in these. At the risk of asking another dumb question, what do you hope the viewer will take from works such as this?
Somehow the word hope doesn't apply.
Okay.
It's not a dumb question at all. Every artist, every performer wants their work to be embraced, and I'm no different. How people embrace the paintings is entirely up to them. Mm. I hope, to use that word, that it inspires an intrigue in ancient Egypt. That intrigue for soul anatomy that I found for so long, I hope that inspires or touches something in them that perhaps awakens something in them that they want to explore more, to become more of who they are, be it through Egyptian stuff or otherwise.
Absolutely. I wish we had time to get into all of them, really, if I'm honest. This is such an interesting body of work overall, with so much depth. Something I found really interesting that we touched on earlier on before the interview was how your work had brought you to an interaction with heritage issues with regards to Egyptianized monuments. This is connected to your work, the Memorial Triptych.
Mm.
Could you tell us a bit about the inspiration behind the Memorial Triptych and what this set of paintings is about?
Yes. So I've got that interest in Egyptomania and all things Egyptian manifested in our era, and how that gets interpreted, whether it's in kitschy cinema representations or, attempts to make authentic statues or whatever. And actually in the meditation, something came through to search this particular term. So I got up and searched the term. I came pretty well straight out of the meditation and onto the computer, and this image of what looked like an Egyptian temple came up. And I'm looking and saying, oh, that's interesting. I knew it was in a modern setting, and it said this is in Kew, Victoria, Melbourne. Kew is one of the suburbs in Melbourne. And I thought, that can't be right. If there was something that spectacular, I would know about it, being the Egyptian hound that I am. Mm. And the more I researched and got information, I found that, in fact, what it was the tomb, the burial monument of a famous Australian colonial figure from the 1800s, who is most famous here for the founding of one of our most iconic newspapers. And he was a Scottish guy that migrated and became very famous in his time, became involved in politics. And rather curiously, the last book that he wrote, which is sitting up here, The Soul, A Study in an Argument, 1903. He was a newspaper mogul, so if you can picture a version of Kerry Packer, but he wasn't, as Jabba the Huttish at all. He was, in fact, he was quite a suave, sophisticated man, rather irascible apparently by all accounts, but a charming Libran too. All Librans are charming.
Speaking as a fellow Libran, I hope so.
Oh, you are as well. I think I'm me as well. I think I knew that subconsciously. That's why I made the remark. He wrote that book, which for its time was utterly groundbreaking. How it was actually received quite well at the time as well. And he wrote other books about economics and different the structure of Parliament in England and then over here. So this was a bit of a departure, but he was fascinated with the soul and whether or not it carried on after death. His burial monument is a replica of Trajan's kiosk on Philae Island, just opposite the Temple of Isis. And it's made out of granite and copper and was finished in 1910, 2 years after he died. They reinterred him in the tomb and then later his wife. And it's this spectacular piece of Egyptianizing architecture that no one really knows about. So I went and saw it for the first time. It was early last year. My sister was over visiting from Adelaide, and we went and looked at it together, and I was just blown away by it. Didn't really know at the time that I'd end up doing a series of 3 paintings on it, which is what happened. I did a lot of research into the monument, which led to researching more and more into David Syme the man and his life. And he really was an interesting character. And it was such an interesting period in Australian history that I never even knew about. The particular triptych is called Memorial 1, 2 and 3. 1 is subtitled Alternate Past, and I've designated that as the duat. And if you're looking at that particular one, it is my take, if it was a different time and a different place where that monument was built, that it would be colorized like that. And I've taken an image from the book of What is in the Underworld with Jehuti as a baboon offering his ibis self, and placed that on top of the burial vault lid with Nebutet and Osset either end. The inside, the actual burial chamber and the sarcophagi is my conception as to how it could have looked in that alternate world. And I tried very hard to get hold of the actual plans, the architectural plans of the tomb, but couldn't find them, because I'm very keen to know if the Egyptianizing architecture was carried through into the burial vault.
Mm-hmm.
As turns out, it was only he and his wife, and then a later descendant that was buried in there. The rest of the family didn't want to go in there for some reason.
Mm.
The other two paintings are the sky and the earth. And the earth one is more how the painting looks today. Sorry, how the monument looks today. The colours are quite true for the copper and the granite that are shown. And I've got a backdrop there of the Melbourne skyline. Mm-hmm. I was able to, in my research, come across some old Polaroids that David Syme's granddaughter had taken, and it was in a special collection part of the Melbourne Library. So I was able to get the original colour of the tiles for the tomb, which have since faded. Yeah. You'll see those on the very first painting. They were that colour initially, the scarab tiles and the square, and a hint of that colour remains today. I was going to go for a grant to try and get the monument restored, but ran into lots and lots of blocks with it. And then eventually it turned out that the cemetery are going to apply for their own grant to get it done. And I said, well, if that's the case and I sell the paintings, I'll donate, a significant portion of what I charge towards that restoration, because it is deteriorating. A lot of the copper fittings and things have stained, and parts of the crypt have cracked. Mm-hmm. It does need attention worthy of a heritage monument. The other thing that happened was that in the Australian Heritage Register, the architect, who was Walter Richmond Butler, a famous arts and crafts movement architect in Australia at the time, was not credited as being the architect of the piece. And this is certainly amongst one of his major feats. It was credited to another architect entirely of the time. So I wrote to the Heritage Register, and after a series of emails going back and forth and being ignored and everything else, it turns out that one of the senior people there did look at my email and look at some of the evidence that I presented. I gave her links and things, and there were other academics that had researched and written on the piece that knew full well that Butler was the architect and not the one listed on the Heritage Register. Yeah. And it's just as of today, or in fact, was it today or yesterday I got the email today, being acknowledged that that is correct and it's going to be changed.
It's fantastic. And
I'm happy about that.
Yeah, absolutely. And let's hope that someone out there with links to an Egyptological society or heritage society hears your story about this and gets involved in helping you, because that would really be fantastic. And you do see these projects happening as well, so that would be really fantastic. And
I think the project will happen, but I think that the cemetery want to be in control of it, and I think I think people get protective about things, and they don't really know who I am or what I'm about apart from my paintings. And as long as the thing gets restored, I'm happy to donate some money towards it if I can sell the paintings, and we'll be happy for my involvement that way if that's the way it works out.
Yeah. Well, I think it's fair to say no one could deny the deep level of research and passion that goes into your work. And it's something that struck me increasingly as I've taken a deep dive into your artistic body of work. And I encourage listeners out there to do the same, because there's a real, like I say, depth and numerous layers and deep symbolism to this work. And just watching it, having seen it as it develops over the years, has really been a pleasure and an honor. So I want to thank you for joining us today and giving us some insight and putting up with my very clumsy intrusions into your world and my lack of understanding of pronunciations and artistic terminology. So I hope you can forgive me for that.
Paul, it's not as bad as you think, and there was nothing clumsy about it whatsoever. It's nice to be able to discuss one's work with someone that appreciates it. And in fact, you've really awarded me quite an honour in having my painting on the cover of your book. Not many artists get an opportunity like that, and I'm still very early in my career. And not only that, the book's bloody good. It's got a great cover and it's a good read.
Thank you so much. Yeah, no, and likewise, thank you for being very, very generous and furnishing us with that, because I think it came together. So I want to thank Setken for joining us today and allowing me into exploring his world. And I encourage all of you out there to get online, have a look at his artwork, and just see this wonderful kind of body of creation that relates to ancient Egypt and deep levels of symbology. Please do check out his work, and as I said, it's on the cover of the book, which he very generously furnished to us as well. And I really feel like the book came together once we had that cover on it. It really completed the piece. So very grateful for that, and really honoured to have you not only on the work but on the show. Thank you for coming on, Setken.
Thanks a lot, Paul, and let me know when the podcast is up and running so I can share it everywhere.
Absolutely will do. Thank you.
That's sadly all we have time for today, but be sure to check back in for new episodes which continue to explore manifestations of the ancient world in the modern, including interviews with a bevy of archaeologists and Egyptologists, Kemetics and Reconstructionists, and key players in historical entertainment, including authors, filmmakers, actors, and game designers. If you like the show, please subscribe and rate it on your preferred platform, and tell all your friends. I've been Dr. Harrison, and this was the Profane Egyptologist podcast. Thanks for listening.